Hi, everyone. Today we'll be talking to Paul LeBlanc, president of Southern New Hampshire University, about his new book, Students First: Equity, Access, and Opportunity in Higher Education, slated to drop in September. My name is Stacey Clawson. I lead JFF's work focused on learning in both traditional and non-traditional post-secondary environments. Paul, I'm going to start by turning it over to you. Please, will you introduce yourself, and will you tell us a little bit about your book and its main themes?
Thank you, Stacey. First of all, it's so nice to see you again. We've known each other for a long time, but it's been a while since we've been together. And a lot of the work described in that book goes back to projects you were working on back at the Gates Foundation days. So you hold a special place in our hearts at SNHU. So the book is written, it's written in sort of two levels. It's a critique. It's a critique of higher education today, because I think we have now baked in deep inequities that are tied to deeply flawed fundamental aspects of what we do. And that's the credit hour, the use of time as a measurement of learning, and a recognition that time exacerbates inequities, because if you are poor, you have less of it. If you don't have a washer dryer in your apartment, it takes you longer to simply have clean clothes than it does you or me. If you don't have a car, it takes longer to get food in your refrigerator. If you don't have employer-funded healthcare program, you might find yourself in a long line waiting for healthcare at a local clinic, if that's how you access your healthcare, if you access it at all. And I was struck, and this is really the kind of the seminal, sort of birth story of this book in some ways, by talking to a student in Boston who was in our competency-based education program, which is a direct assessment program, not tied to the credit hour, not tied to time. And so she was wholly self-paced. If you look, she was poor, single mom, poorest neighborhood in Boston. At that time, I think a 7 or 8 year old daughter with chronic respiratory problems. If you looked at her transcripts from the 2 local community college, it was littered with F's and W's, because every time her little girl got sick, she would miss a week of class, exams, fall behind. If it was before the withdrawal date, she took the W. If it was after, she took the F, and she was burning up her lifelong limit on Pell Grant. We put her into our program, and she had a great phrase when she was describing this, why it worked for her. She said, every time my daughter gets sick, I hit the pause button because I drive the schedule. And then she paused and said, I am the schedule, which is a great line. I am the schedule, right? So higher education built for her, as opposed to her having to meet our expectations around time and place. As a result, she raced to the completion of her degree. She was really smart, and she was gritty and persevering, but we didn't give her a system that worked in her life. And this book is an argument for fundamentally rethinking. It takes that big picture, and I'll just finish here, because you and I work in this space every day. It really tries to come at it from the practicalities of a practitioner. Like, what would it have to look like if we rethought financial aid? What does it have to look like if we rethink assessment? Like, I don't want it to simply be a critique. I want it to be a bit of a blueprint for how we move forward. And at the heart of that really is CBE.
Well, we hear, especially after the last year, that there are practitioners, leaders asking themselves, how do we do this work? I don't think it's even as much about the what anymore, because we are all focused on how to get past what we've been faced with over the last year, how to get people back to work, and how to improve those inequities that you referenced. And so that blueprint, it really resonates, because that's what we hear from the field is, tell us, what are other people doing? What's working? And how do we make progress quickly? So that really resonates, and glad to see in your book that you do have some specifics and concrete examples, case examples that you talk about. It was really helpful to read about that.
Thank you. And Stacey, as you know as well as I do, we're a regulated industry in which doing things very differently is really hard, right? We draw the sort of the look of our accreditors, of our state licensing organizations, from our federal financial aid perspective. So I've long argued that in a regulated environment, we have to create safer spaces for experimentation, for trying new things. We're not going to be like journalism and music, which reinvented themselves almost overnight, right? We're more like healthcare in this respect. But healthcare is experimenting, it's trying new things. If you think about the way that healthcare has devolved from the large hospital to the urgent care center, to the minute clinic, to the community clinic, right? Like telemedicine, really pushing out. And one chapter is dedicated to, can we do a competency-based dispersal of financial aid that has risk sharing, that pays for performance, that really lets us tie to the individual competency instead of time. And the department has the authority to do that. We have experimental site authority. We can do this. This is not impossible. And there are so many good examples in our industry. I think competency-based education especially went through sort of the sort of exuberance, the irrational exuberance. It's the Gartner curve. Then we went to the side, oh, didn't promise what. And now if you take a look, it's quietly spreading through the industry.
Well, you mentioned the demonstration projects and that have been around for some time. Competency-based education has been around since the 1960s. When we look to the next phase of education, and we really need and rely on that innovation, why is this the moment for CBE?
So it's a great question. And so if you really open up the aperture historically, anytime this nation has been through this kind of collective trauma, we have reinvented higher education. From the ashes of the Civil War, the Morrill Act, and the creation and expansion of our public system, from the Depression and World War II, we get the GI Bill and the great democratization of higher education, including the community college movement. So I have as an optimist in these dark times, I think, is this the time where we really have to fundamentally rethink? And we see tremendous shifts in the nature of work in our country and in our world, from globalization and technology to the displacement that comes with automation and AI to, as Jamie Marisoto said, our sort of algorithmic cobots, our coworkers that we will all have in our lives. However you think about that, whether pessimistically or optimistically, we know that work is changing very dramatically. And my hope is that in a time of such tremendous change, we start to drop old binaries. So the idea that it had to be knowledge or skills, or knowledge or competencies, it has to be both. That's a polarity in which we have to hold them together in equilibrium, self-reinforcing. I think another one is, online or face-to-face. Why are we thinking about that anymore? I'm old enough to remember when word processing came along, and someone would say, "Are you going to type that, or are you going to word process it?" It's like, that would be a weird question today. And in fact, if you were writing, Stacey, you and I probably wouldn't think like, sometimes I write with a pen, sometimes I write with my keyboard, sometimes I'm speaking, right? And it's all just writing. It's all just learning. And we need to create the fluidity in our delivery models that allows students to take just the right modality in that moment in the way that works best for them. So far more student-centered. So I'm optimistic that in this time, we now know we have to be laser focused on demonstrable skills tied to in-demand jobs. We can't do short-term education programs like the kind that were just a disaster 10 and 20 years ago, right? So it's an invitation of transparency. It's an invitation to alignment between higher ed and workforce. This has been happening for a while, and it's cliche to say it, but the pandemic has both accelerated and amplified all of these things we were talking about in 2019. So my hope is actually that this just impels us towards a new reframing that moves away from the tired binaries to a set of new ones. And that includes bringing together knowledge and skills. That's okay. Those have to happen together.
Well, knowledge and skills, and you mentioned education and workforce. Really focus on the learner, not just the student or the worker. And that learning can happen in any environment. Continuing kind of on this path, in the book you mentioned, that we have not fully come to grips with the ways that technology, automation, artificial intelligence will replace human labor, and in both higher level skills or in lower skill manufacturing. Can you talk a little bit about this and how that shows up in your book?
Yeah, so there's some evidence. So one of the things that happened in the Great Recession of 2009, 2010 is that a lot of jobs went away, and there was some evidence that automation actually picked up the pace because there was this opportunity to come back, right, to rev back up again, but to do so by more quickly automating. We are in the middle of this change, so we don't know, right? I think crystal balls are notorious. And I often say it feels right now, it's sort of like climate change. It's big, It's slow rolling, yet its impacts are being felt already all around us, and we're all trying to make sense of it. It's not like anyone who's denying it is sort of crazy at this point, but also anyone who can tell you exactly what it's going to look like, its pace, and how it's going to play out. It's like that's harder. In some ways, I think we're doing something similar right now in that confluence of higher education and work and the impact of automation, et cetera. You've got right now all of these pretty dire predictions about worker displacement, and they sit next to predictions about the shortage of workers. You have in the short term, employment signs all over the place because a whole lot of people are saying, you know what, not going back to that job. In the recovery after the Great Recession, 60% of job recovery were in new jobs. So 60% of the jobs that were lost never came back. Where's that happening now? And I think the migration of students to STEM and health is an instinctual migration towards robot-proof jobs. Oh, those jobs won't get displaced. By the way, I think somewhat naively, we don't know that, but it's a little bit like saying, climate change is happening. I'm moving out of the Southwest and I'm going to move to Oregon. It's like, well, are you sure? Like, is Oregon okay? Like, do we know that's good? Like, sounds good in theory. Is are you sure healthcare and STEM's okay? So I think in the middle of all this, it's a little hard to know the contours, but we know these great tectonic shifts are happening. And this is why, organizations like JFF are needed more than ever right now, because it's in this conversation, these polarities that we have to hold together, that we can sort this out together.
Thank you. I want to pick up on the competency-based education work that you focused on in your book and that you're leading at SNHU. So you talked about what is competency-based education. A couple of other things you cover in the book are the benefits for alternative delivery models, such as virtual and flexible learning environments, and then the challenges that learners have in just accessing education. What's the relationship among those things to the model, CBE model, or other innovations that are happening right now?
Yeah, I think fundamentally, if you sort of stand back, our traditional delivery model said we're going to prescribe a lot of inputs, and if these are the right ones, we can have faith in what comes out at the other end of the process. And for a long time, the labor market believed us. College degree was a reliable signal of all kinds of skills that the labor market valued, that you could communicate well, that you had critical thinking skills, you had quantitative skills. And as you know, over these last 30 years, there's a widening gap between the sense that higher ed has of the quality of what it produces and what employers are telling us, right? That famous, I think it was a Gallup or a Pew study, there was something like 92% of provosts believe their graduates are ready for day one, and I think it's 12%, something of the sort of magnitude of employers agree with them. Lots of reasons, we can unpack that all day long. But I think what CBE invites us to do, competency-based education invites us to do, is actually shift the spotlight from the inputs to the outputs and to say, we're going to be crystal clear about the claims we make for learning, and we're going to be really trustworthy in terms of how we know. And if you're making claims for what students can do with what they know, remember, it's not or, it's and, what they can do with what they know, you really have to think hard about performance-based assessment, right? You're testing what they can do. It's what we do, by the way, any place where your and my life matters. Like, it's great. Like, we'll trust you. We love your GPA, your 4.0 if you're a pilot. But you're still going to take the FAA exams. You're still going to be in the simulator. You're still going to sit in the right-hand seat under the watchful eye of an experienced pilot for hours and hours and hours before we let you take the controls on the left-hand side of the seat. The same with engineering, same with healthcare, et cetera. Those are all performance-based assessment because we don't trust traditional modes of grading and thinking about education. But to go back to your question, when we do those two things, clarity of the claims we make, crystal clear claims, and again, in our world now, what we're talking about is, and let's make sure those claims line up with the needs of employers, that they create opportunity, that they actually are the things that people need. And let's be able to assess in a way that employer says, if you guys make this claim, I trust you. Like, I know your graduates can do the things that you say. That's so powerful. And what's also powerful about it is it then frees us up to say, we kind of don't care about how you get people there. The modality matters much less. Why do we care if it's self-paced or time-based? Why do we care if you did it face to face or online, because the test will be in your ability to do the things that we claim you can do. Um, and I think that's such a freeing shifting of the spotlight, because then it invites all kinds of innovation. But with that invitation innovation, especially in our regulated world again, there is a commensurate requirement, responsibility for transparency. So you have to be able to say what those outcomes are. You have to hold yourself accountable. Because we can't have, and this is where I have to channel a little bit my friends in the consumer protection side of the house, because they hear innovation and they hear, oh, here we go again. We, as institutions and as an industry, have resisted the kind of transparency and accountability that I think is required to go hand in hand with innovation.
Well, it's not surprising you bring up quality and assessment in the same sentence. One of your chapters is titled Assessment, the Hardest Work.
Yeah.
And, that's starting to get at what you're talking about here. Maybe you could go a little further about the role of assessment, the role of data, and what higher education leaders or employers, workforce, what are the steps that those leaders can take to start to focus on the outputs, to start to focus on quality, and what kind of mechanisms would that look like? What does that look like on the ground?
Yeah, and you've seen actually this deep sort of flaw with the way that so much assessment happens during the pandemic, because you're sending kids home with open book exams and then wondering why we're seeing runaway cheating in America. And it's because they're taking the path of least possible resistance to the thing that you said was important to them, which is learning, grade on the exam. So if you think about your question about how do we start moving, if I'm sort of trying to lead that within my organization, I'm really starting to do a lot more work around project-based learning, the way a place like Worcester Polytech does so much of, and they have a center on project-based learning. I'm talking about authentic assessments. I'm talking about assessments that ask students to apply the knowledge they have in the ways that will happen in the real world, the way that employers will ask of them. And by the way, that makes that assessment much more critically feel like learning, like now it's part of the learning, and relevant. Like what is the critique that so many students have about both their learning and their assessments? It's like no one's asking them to take multiple choice exams at work. That's not what we do. And in fact, the very behaviors that we associate with cheating are often sometimes the most rewarded behaviors in the workplace. Hey, Stacey, I need, what's going on with blah, blah, blah. I can get you that answer like that. I was like, wait, time out. Like, what does that look like? We were talking, we do a lot of work with the Institute for the Future out of Palo Alto, and they were very funny. They were talking about how in the workplace now, somebody was assigned, a young employee, brand new, right out of college, was assigned a project that would normally take maybe 7 days. And at the end of the day one, he sort of handed it over. I was like, whoa, like, how'd that happen? He goes, oh, like I have a whole bunch of friends who work here and here and here, and I call them and they help me do it. He goes, you can't like call other companies. It's like, and then his are like, but that's my network. Like that's what I always did. I ask, right? And the employer was thinking more like, no, this is closed, and you've got to get it right or wrong, not. And so we have to start rethinking the work and how learning happens, and we have to start rethinking what counts for assessment. And the reality is, we can often be hypercritical of higher education. There's just a ton of good, authentic assessment going on out there, project-based learning. So you got to find out where it's happening in your institution. You have to shine a light on it. And then I think we have to recognize learning as it happens, not only in the confines of our classroom. You alluded to this a little bit earlier, but when we have students out doing internships, workplace learning, like let's get very rigorous about the clarity of what they're learning and how we know, and let's employ and leverage those employer partners. I think those are very powerful. We've started mapping competencies and asking the question about how we know for all the skills that we don't typically associate with the curriculum. So if I use the example all the time of, the 20-year-old treasurer of student government on campus manages a $2 million budget. She has some competencies. By the way, they're the competencies that we also cover in some accounting classes. Can we capture that? And how do we know? How do we know she's good at it? So I think it's a really exciting invitation to move assessment away from a kind of judgment of, Stacey, how are you at this moment in time, to actually saying, let's make assessment part of the learning, right? So So get in that project and get your hands dirty. Show me that you can actually do the thing.
Well, and you talked about partnerships with employers. I mean, taking that even one step further, um, how do we use competency-based education in work-based learning? There is such a role for that, but our work-based learning models haven't necessarily focused on the learning and the outputs and the role of assessment. It's a little easier in those more technical, skills where you're actually where you have those concrete assessments. But in work environments where every day learners and workers are demonstrating those human skills, or they are working in projects, collaborating with other employees, and so figuring out the role of assessment in work-based learning is something that JFF is really embracing right now too, with partners in the field. I don't know if you have any comments on that or anything that you've learned along the way.
Well, we join you in that exploration, and we're really interested in with some of our employer partners. The question we're asking is, and it's really in this rethinking PLA, but can we go into an organization and say, you've been in this position for a long time. These are what your employer are very clear about, the sort of keys to success, the competencies you have to possess. How can we know that you've been demonstrating that? And can we tie into employer systems of performance evaluation, et cetera, in a way that we can reliably depend on that, right? And it forces us to think about ourselves as being not the final arbiter of performance assessment, but a sort of auditor and confirmation function of right. And when you start to think about that, now you're really rethinking the role of the institution. We talk about no wasted learning, right? Like you take someone who's been out of school, maybe they tried college 10 years ago, they weren't ready, or life got in the way, now they're back. They didn't stop learning for 10 years. And we need much better and I think streamlined PLA processes. And we're doing some interesting projects right now. We have a kind of PLA machine, as it's called, project, which is really trying to look at how do we harness data and how do we use machine learning with large scale employers where you get many thousands of people in the same job. How can we go in and really know? It's kind of a fun project. We'll go out over the next 2 years.
Well, I'm not surprised you're already steps ahead of some of us in that work. It really is the next generation of prior learning assessment that's needed right now. And there are institutions, systems starting to do this work. So it's actually really exciting to see, because it's hard work putting that infrastructure in place and the validation for learning and outcomes and evidence-based PLA, but it is also something that an institution can be a leader in, and they can put these infrastructures in place and these learning modules in place to help students along to be able to self-assess, to be able to demonstrate their own learning through portfolio-based assessments, et cetera. So it is exciting to think about that next generation of PLA and the role of competencies in that.
Yeah.
And how I look forward to learning more about what you're doing in that area.
Yeah, and Stacey, I would say that I think it's just such powerful and fascinating and fun to look at the role of simulations and simulated environments and that ability for a student to demonstrate. So I think about, I chaired the CALE board for a long time. It's an organization I love, but when you think about that process, which we couldn't even tell students how many credits they would likely earn. So I'm going to do all this work and I don't even know, and it's going to take a lot of time. And but could we put you into a simulated environment? We've done a project with Boston Children's Hospital using our game design students as undergraduates who created a simulation for nurses who work in pediatric emergency care. So one of the key competencies, like if you and I go in and we get the same dose of a medicine, probably not going to be critical. The difference between a 2-month-old and an 8-month-old, life and death. And it's high stress. So they built a whole thing with, an actual syringe that tied to a sensor, tied to a simulation, and you're in this thing and the conditions are changing. And they're able to measure and see the sort of attainment of competency and improvement in performance. And I think that whole world, anybody who is a gamer, is married to a gamer, has a kid who's a gamer, has seen them in front of, lose time, get lost in a thing, be challenged to do hard stuff, and then the endorphin rush of when they break through and they get it. It's like, what if learning could look like that? What if learning was so engaging? What if the assessment of your skill was so engaging that you just want to spend more time, not less? Our friends who are pilots talk about that with simulators. Like, it's high stress because you got to get certified, but the actual thing of being in the simulator is so much fun. Like, you're doing this thing, right? And you're showing your skills and you're honing it. And in doing it, you're actually improving your skill. So I think it's super exciting. ASU is doing some really good work with immersive virtual reality. This, as you said earlier, there's so much good work happening across the industry that I think we sometimes forget in our critique. At least I do, to remind myself.
Yeah, we need to celebrate those moments and that good work. And we also need to evaluate it and tell those stories.
Yeah.
And I think higher education can do a little bit better job of doing that because we have these pockets of innovation and impact, and yet we don't always know about the work that's happening. So
it's not the age-old problem. I mean,
yeah.
You know this, right? Like, there's so much intelligence and creativity going on, and it always feels like pockets. Like, we had a great Google grant where we were able to do a simulation that looked at people's ability to work in teams in a game environment. It was really great, and it's got great results. It sort of sits at SNHU. Like, how do we get that out there in a way that we share better? And yeah.
Well, we appreciate all the work that you're doing. Anything else in our time together that you want to share with the audience? And then I have one more question before we part.
This feels, you said it, which is there something about this time? And I think what the time invites us, I said it in passing, but I really think it's this invitation to coming out of this pandemic, going into a world that feels in some ways more uncertain than ever, to reaffirm the centrality of higher education as being part of the solution at a time when for so many Americans it feels like it's part of the problem. As a first generation immigrant kid, my parents had 8th grade educations. My access to high quality, affordable higher education transformed my life. I feel almost corny about how powerful that is. And now what we see, and you see it in, I just stepped on as chair of the ACE board. We see it in the annual Gallup surveys that we commission on what is the public attitude towards American higher education. It's plummeting. And look, at some of it's political and it's stronger with Republicans and Democrats. It's plummeting with Democrats. It's plummeting with people of color. Less so, interestingly, they have more hope for us. They who have been least well served, ironically, have more hope for us. But across the board, it's coming down. How do we get higher education back to being part of the solution and not part of the problem? Which is why I love the work that you all are doing at JFF, because I think it really is a pathway. Because the first thing we're being asked to do today, in a time when people they feel the inequity, the inequality of our economy and our society, and it feels like my ability to be successful in a job, in a career that allows me to take better care of my family is the first piece. It's not the only piece, but it's the first piece, and it begins a pathway. So I'm sorry, that sounded very polemical all of a sudden. I didn't mean to, but
that's why I asked the question. And so maybe we'll end on kind of looking to the future. So I understand there may be a new book in the pipeline. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what we have to look forward to.
Yeah, well, thank you. The book that we've been talking about comes out in September, but it turns out that with no travel and no entertainment, I had time to write. So there's a second book, and there's a one complete pass, and I just signed a contract for it last week. It'll be out in 2022. And that book asks a little bit more of a provocative question. The question it's asking is, can our industry learn to love its students again? My wife said, did it ever love its students? Like, yeah, I think so. I feel like it did when I was a student, But my concern is, and I'm going to use the example of policing in America. I know lots of police officers who are really good people, and they really care deeply about the communities in which they work. But I fear that they may be working in a system that's so broken that even well-intended people are complicit in an industry that doesn't serve the community in which it's supposed to serve. I wonder, when I think about higher education, my colleagues, so many good people who care deeply about the work, care deeply about our industry, care deeply about students. But is our industry so broken? Does it commit a kind of psychic violence starting with the pressure we put on kids in high school and the admissions process, the mental health issues we cause from that, the kids we leave behind and out of that admissions process, so we don't help them dream bigger dreams for themselves. It doesn't feel like a reality, all the way through to the exploitation of graduate students. I have two daughters who finished doctoral programs, and they both talk about this. And they would say this is true for all their friends in graduate programs. They feel a little screwed, and exploited in the way they get used within that system, all the way to the 38 million Americans who gave us a try and didn't finish, and now they've got debt and no credits and no degree. I mean, credits and no degree. It's worse. And I don't know. It's like we can all sort of say we're doing really good work. I care deeply. This pains me, but is our system so broken? So the question I try to ask is, how do we get back to a sort of central focus on students and what matters most, which starts with mattering? Do we build systems that tell students they matter? I don't know. There's nothing very much about the admissions process that tells me it makes students feel like they really matter. And I could sort of move through a whole bunch of things. Even the way we design the hours of our offices. We design them for us. Start at 8, close at 4. Have you met a 20-year-old? Right? I mean, so even in the sort of simple day-to-day things. And then I think the second section is if we can get our heads around how do we make students matter again? How do we help them aspire? How do we give them bigger dreams? The second part is then how do our institutions have to rethink themselves? How do they have to look different? And then the last part is what is our place, your place and my place as leaders and educators? How do we have to think differently about our work and our roles? So we'll see. It's a more, in some ways, the first book is grounded in practitioner world. This book is a somewhat bigger perspective, perhaps a more provocative one, and maybe not worth the read, but we'll see in 2022.
Well, we look forward to it. And the role of human-centered design and in learning, I mean, that's, a focus that we all can get behind. So we definitely look forward to that next phase of your work. But September 1st, we can't wait for your book to come out.
Thank you.
And we really appreciate your time together today, Paul.
Thank you so
much.
Always so good to be with you again.